Hi everybody. I am delighted to be here with Loraine van Tuyl. Hi Loraine, welcome to Imagine Proud.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to join you.
I just get so overjoyed when I hear stories like yours, Loraine, of kind of, professionals, clinical psychologists coming out and saying, yeah, I've had a spiritual awakening and I'm a shamanic healer. It's like, what's the big deal, too. So I so appreciate you being part of this movement, and I'm really excited to hear more about your story and your work and kind of dive a bit deeper into your Soul Sanctuary Alchemy course, which sounds amazing. So we've already done a two-part blog on your story.
Thank you so much.
No, but so I just wanted to cover a bit of that, if that's okay with you first, in case some people might not have seen that. So you're an author, a clinical psychologist, and a shamanic healer, and you've written a book, your memoir, Amazon Wisdom Keeper, Psychologist's Memoir of Spiritual Awakening. And as soon as I saw that title, I was just like, oh, this lady will so get emerging proud. And I was trying to remember how we connected, and I think it was a mutual friend of ours from the Netherlands who you knew from Suriname who introduced us.
Yes. But I think even before that, it was Katrina Michelle who had featured your documentary.
Sure. So Katrina.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful how everybody's so connected in this movement. It's lovely. I'm just really delighted to be talking to you today. So just to give people a little bit of history, I wondered if I could ask you a bit about your childhood, because it really resonated with me when I was reading about you describing how you were kind of a seeker from age 7, and you kind of had this deep insight wisdom, and you kind of wanted to run away from conventional society. And something that really stuck out to me was you said that you had a housekeeper in Suriname where you time who was West African, is that right? And you kind of had some guidance, ancestral kind of West African guidance from her. I just wondered if you would mind kind of giving us a bit more information about that, because it sounds intriguing.
Sure. Let me just tell you then a little bit where I'm from. I'm from Suriname, which is a country right above Brazil. And like many of the people who live there, most of us are multiracial. So myself, I am part West African. My great-grandmother is, and she probably was also mixed indigenous. And the rest of my ancestors are Chinese. There were people, the indigenous people were there, and then slaves were brought over, like in many of the Caribbean countries nearby. And then after slavery was abolished, a lot of Asian immigrants came and were contract workers. The Chinese people came as merchants. And so I have that heritage. I also have one ancestor who is Jewish, Portuguese Jewish. And so many of the people, actually, majority of the people there are West African Creole now mixed with the many different people there. Also a large East Indian group. But what is pretty unique about Suriname is many of the slaves started to run away from the beginning of being captured and held captive there. So there's a large Maroon population, about 60,000 people and several different tribes. And in recent years, some of the Maroons started to come back to the city. It's a very small capital. Most of the country is covered by rainforest, Amazon rainforest. It's actually the most tree-covered country in the world, according to the World Bank. So there was rainforest everywhere I went, even next door to me. But we did have a patch of land that my parents loved to go to and cultivate. It was about maybe 4 acres, and there were fruit trees and vegetables. In any event, many of the people there also employ different housekeepers, actually more than one often, and more than one gardener. And so one of them who stayed the longest with us was a Maroon woman, and she was extremely grounded. And even at that age, I was already very intrigued. It's a very multicultural society, a lot of different religious temples and mosques, but the groups that really attracted me and appealed to me were the indigenous people and the Maroon people. And so she was in my home, and there was this immediate connection with her and a daily connection. And I spend a lot of the time just being with her. She was actually a very quiet woman, but there were times that we would talk and speak, and it was mostly when she was concerned about me going into the rainforest and just teaching me, making sure I knew how to speak to the nature spirits and be safe. Wow. So that really was very meaningful to me, because I could tell in my soul, this is the language that I want to speak. And I also knew a bit about that just watching documentaries, very low budget, low key documentaries that my father enjoyed watching about the indigenous people and the animals in the rainforest. And he was so intrigued, and so was I. So this really started awakening this spark in me probably before 7, but by 7, I think the feistiness in me started to come out.
Wow, thank you for that. What a beautiful, colourful history. And I was thinking about, we were chatting earlier about your work now and how you work with a lot of ancestral trauma, and it's really fascinating, isn't it, how we kind of come full circle to where our journey started often in the work that we do. So I'd be interested to hear more about that too. But so what happened next, Loraine? Because I know that you ended up having to move to Florida.
Yes. So Suriname became independent in 1975, and I was only about 6 back then. And so it was a very peaceful nation, actually, compared to its neighbors. All the different groups were getting along quite well. The population of Dutch colonists, it's the only Dutch Dutch-speaking country in South America, was actually quite small, 1% or so. And so when the emancipation happened, there was a lot of scrambling and struggling for money, resources, this independence aid, so to speak. And so 5 years later, a revolution broke out. And for our doing, it was quite violent, even though compared to our neighbors, again, not, but there were accidental deaths and burnings and kidnappings and that sort of thing when you try to overthrow the ones in charge, the dictators in charge. So eventually my family moved. My mother was a principal of a junior high school. My father was an architect. And so they were quite established in their careers. They had studied abroad, actually. A lot of people studied abroad in Holland. So they had brought in this Western mentality as well. And especially my mother, she was very much an academic. And this had really saved her life, coming from a big family of 12. And so I butted heads a lot with her already on that level in terms of the intellect and soul, in terms of thought and awareness. Yeah. And I was quite feisty, and she was my first, she was quite feminist in her own right, quite powerful. She was quite feared, actually, by some, of even the other principals around and her male teachers. So she was quite a force to reckon with. So you can imagine the little spirit in me when I'd be like, I would rather die than live a life that's not my own. I would say things like that when she would tell me, I am just trying to, tell you, and I'm older than you, and I'm your mother, and that sort of thing. So she had to, learn to really respect me and try to figure out where this was coming from. So egewees, the Dutch word, your own wisdom, but also egewees could mean your way or the highway. She always said, you are so terribly egoïst. And but there was sometimes, sort of a glimmer of admiration for that, or frustration. So that developed this part of me, like, maybe there's something there that she's seeing, respecting, even though it was quite minor. But anyway, so after this, we moved to Miami and started there all over again. And it was this little glimmer that helped me through many years of being lost and having to find my way again.
Gosh, that must have been such a culture shock after living in the rainforest and
Yes,
kind of communing
yes.
with nature spirits as you were describing, and feeling that soul connection, to be thrown into kind of the really westernized lifestyle. Did that impact you negatively?
Oh, for sure. And I felt so connected to nature that my connection to community kind of took a little bit of a backseat, and I took it for granted. But I must say that was huge also. That was the loss that I also experienced, because we lived with all my relatives in one street. As I said, my mother had 12 siblings, so at least 6 of them with their families, and all my cousins lived side by side with each other. And so there was a lot of loving community as well. And even so, my calling, I had such high standards that even within them, I sometimes felt out of place. But when I lost all of that and had nothing, and it felt, because my mother also didn't want to join many of friends or relatives who moved to Holland, which is what most people did after the revolution, because she didn't like the weather, and it just like, no way, no how, going back to that. So we moved to Miami, and my father had a few relatives there, but everybody was quite dispersed. So it felt like moving into a concrete jungle and being completely lost, completely different culture, way of thinking, and finding your way. As an adolescent, I was 13 then. I was 10 when the revolution broke out. So that, combined with your normal adolescent challenges, yes, for sure,
Yeah. Did
had
you
a lot of trouble.
sort of trying to fit in with conventional, like you describe yourself sort of throwing yourself into academia and studying for your doctorate and everything, and then there was one thing that really stood out to me as well at that point, and I wonder if this was a turning point for you. You described almost having a hallucination type experience of hearing drumming, which you
Yeah.
then questioned if it was a
Yes.
pathology
Yes.
yourself because of your training. Sorry if
Yeah.
I'm jumping forwards too. It's just that
No.
the things that I really remember about your story
Right. Right.
resonate
Right.
with,
Right.
because they're patterns I hear so often with people.
Yes, it started even in my adolescence, where I was just a wild child and going out and all that. And my younger self from the rainforest, when I had gotten out of abusive relationship, um, started to appear, and I retrieved her, and that started my healing. And I decided then that I wanted to become, well, actually, I without cognitively deciding, that appealed to me. Eventually became a psychology major and ended up in clinical psychology as a program. That was already a big deal for me, to be more practice oriented than a researcher. And yes, in that program then, when I started to discover that trusting your intuition and trusting that more, your personal experiences, more than some of the evidence-based research, or the evidence-based research that was out there, was triggering this intense feeling inside of me of being threatened. And I didn't know. It actually felt like an extinction, like the rainforest was going to become extinct. I didn't know how to connect it. I thought it was loggers or somebody threatening the rainforest. That's what it felt like when it started to happen. I did hear the drumming, but I was like, why am I feeling this way? And now later in hindsight, it makes sense. It is a certain kind of thing that is in threat, being threatened of extinction. But when these things happen, we don't understand what's going on. We're trying to come up with some story. So that's what happened with me. And so, yeah, then the digging started. My great grandmother, who's the West African great grandmother, appeared to me for the first time when I wrote a student newsletter. I wrote an article for a student newsletter, and her wisdom started to come through in that newsletter. And from then on, I just kept on opening that up.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It's fascinating, and just there are so many kind of resonances with people's stories, and I assume you see that too in your practice. And I'd like to talk to you a bit about that too. But I wonder how you kind of bridged from having those experiences and kind of learning in a very academic framework way. How did you manage to bring this intuitive wisdom into what you do, and ultimately create this new kind of holistic healing model that you've created? And we'd love to hear more about that, but if you're able to kind of talk a bit about how you managed to bridge those, that would be
it was definitely a series of initiations. So I'll just point out some of the highlights. One of the things that I ended up doing is a dissertation, cross-national dissertation, and I went back to Suriname to do this and made it a qualitative dissertation and started to study this spiritual orientation of people there, because I just needed this affirmation for myself that it wasn't just me who was experiencing this. And so I did find out that some people do have a more holistic perspective, a more spiritual perspective, even though they might not call it so, which was helping them get along with one another in a more harmonious way. So from then on, I started to follow this path. Teachers came and crossed my path, of course, and I started to have more and more intense experiences. I had a teacher who was informed by Lakota indigenous ways, and that's how I actually 17 years ago first downloaded this model in a sweat lodge. And it was very visceral. It was a crystal egg sitting on a medicine wheel, and I knew that it represented the balance of above and below, and this egg in the middle. It was an amethyst crystal egg, and the medicine wheel. And I had just newly learned about all this and just newly got this little medicine wheel, and the medicine wheel representing each of the elements and the 4 directions. And so from then on, excuse me, let me have a little bit of water.
Sure. I was just thinking, just while you're taking a break, about how a couple of things actually have sparked me thinking from what you said about, you know, the meaning in so-called psychosis, and how actually when we do look at the deeper meaning, it's so meaningful. And also, you know, you just said that it's taken 17 years to develop this training model that you've developed, and I think it's really important for people to hear that, and myself included, because I think we can get really impatient when we have an awakening, when we get a really clear message and it feels like it needs to happen now. And yet, you know, to hear you say that the integration of that vision has taken that long is really reassuring and kind of validating for me as well. And like you say, you know, going back and doing your dissertation was part of your validation, and I feel that that's kind of what this campaign is for me. It's like validating my own sanity in a way, like connecting with people that it's not just me, you know. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yes. And what I would say to that is some things I had an idea about, such as writing my book. I knew that since I was a child. I didn't know what kind of book. So all that time I was working towards that and articulating what I felt was coming through and taking my time with it, because a lot of the information that was coming through wasn't quite the same as what I had read out there. So that actually took the longest time. This model was just something that I didn't even imagine would ever become a model or a course that would teach. It was just something that I experimented with my clients. And it was 10 years later when I learned adaptive hypnosis. I became a adaptive hypnosis practitioner and formally was trained a little bit more than 10 years ago to use shamanic healing, but I was already doing this within myself. And so I just tried to refine what I was doing with my clients, trying to meet their needs, trying to prevent risk and different things, little not loopholes, pitfalls and things, traps that they would get into. And so after that felt like, wow, this is a solid model, which is like maybe 2 years ago. And I started to come out with my book and think of a second book. Then it emerged as an idea of a model to teach others in a more broader way. So it wasn't like 70 years ago that I was even thinking about that. It just developed, it evolved over time.
Yeah. Would you mind explaining a bit more about the detail of the course?
Yeah.
You talk about the 7 directions, and you kind of started to say a bit about that in your vision that you had with the egg and the medicine wheel. But for those of us that don't really understand a lot about that,
Sure.
Because when I first read that, I was like, oh, that sounds really appealing to me too.
Yes, definitely. So the above and below, as above, so below, I think many of us are familiar with that. And that is something that is a theme that runs through my names, Loraine, the cross of Loraine, my Chinese name, my earth name is Rainbow Crystal, and my Chinese name means golden flower, and they all have that meaning. So this was something that actually intuitively, when I started to find out more about the meaning of my names, like I got, this is sort of my mission, what I'm here to do, to embody the spirit. And the elements are also, when I say learning to talk to the nature spirits, that's what Elfrida, my maroon housekeeper, would teach me, to read the water. So I was very connected to the idea of the elements, and I would already see people's psychology in terms of the elements. I would think of my mother as being too fiery, or sometimes too rigid and too earthy, my father too watery, wanting harmony, or too airy, not grounded enough. So I had a very intuitive understanding of these elements. So when I learned about the medicine wheel and the 4 sacred directions, which mean many different things, could be your mental, your physical, mental, emotional, psychological aspects of your being. It could be these elements, it could be different stages of development. All that made perfect intuitive sense. It just mapped up perfectly. So when I learned about shamanic healing, which is accessing a guide within yourself, especially nature guides and things like that, mythical figures, archetypal figures, what I discovered with my clients, it felt that this was very powerful, got them in touch with their inner wisdom, but often their ego mind and cultural conditioning was so powerful that it would still skew what information would come through. So for example, you could have somebody with a lot of air and getting a lot of connection with spirit guides, but never grounding it. Or maybe having an abusive history and being very afraid of anger, because anger was expressed always in a very negative and harmful way, so that they would have all this information, but they would not allow them to feel the appropriate anger, passion, ability to stand up and really stand in their power. So these are just some examples of what I would see. And so when I now have them connect to their guides, what I do first is connect them to each of these elements or directions. And the 7th is the heart connection. So we first go into the heart and go in an inner scape. That's a natural scape. And I have them realize that the peace they feel, the connection they feel to the elements, is actually what's also in their bodies. They have each of these elements in their body, and that's what I love about them. It's very grounded. And then I open these directions above and below and have them connect with a tree guide, so they can connect themselves with it. And then I connect them to each of the elements all around, and they have particular psychological teachings that are particularly helpful. We can go more into that if you like, but just to set that up. So it's air in front, fire to the right, earth in the back, and water to the left. And as you can tell, they're kind of opposites of each other. So it gets them in this paradoxical mindset, which is, what this fast field is all about and what our cognitive mind has a lot of trouble with.
Yeah.
So they're right in the middle of that. And each of these brings psychological qualities that are antidotes to what we tend to have the most trouble with. So I open it up in terms of these elements, but then invite their personal guides also in. And so they end up with a very balanced 3D model of support that also offers them the psychological support. It starts correcting all that they're doing in this emergence. It's
Wow.
kind of like helping them become caterpillar goop in a way that is supported, where they're getting the soul nutrients that they normally don't have. And it's a very protected cocoon or chrysalis or womb, if you will, where they can then fully dissolve and go through this dark night of the ego, I call it, not dark night of the soul.
That's
And then we emerge, grow, and develop their wings, and then we emerge and do a lot of healing in that process.
Oh, wow. Beautiful. That sounds so powerful. It was just making me think when you were describing it there about sort of everything I see now is like paradoxical and, the duality. So just bringing those dualities into unity within the body, within the heart space in the body, like pure integration. That's just, you created a really good visualization of that for me then as you described it. So yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of like starting with the end in sight, because it feels like if yours just started with one side, it just, if somebody's dualism I've discovered is a huge, big thing, right? And so you could do all this healing work, but the integration is sabotaged because of the dualism that keeps them being the overlay. So I start with them already correcting that as much as possible, getting them in that space.
Gosh,
And
yeah. That makes so much sense to what we were chatting a bit earlier before we started to record about the safety elements and how important this is to be acknowledged because of the safety elements of, as you were saying then about if the duality is worked on and people are not kind of embodied. You were talking earlier about, I wonder if you'd explain a bit more maybe about when you're helping people to be more grounded in their bodies, and that's maybe when they're most at risk of that maybe that if they have an entity that may be present, of kind of having some repercussions around that. Would you mind explaining a little bit?
Yes. So I kind of see this as having a 7-point anchor before doing the deep diving and free falling into what our intuition and soul is calling for us to heal, which often is not just our own personal trauma from this life. And this is something that a lot of people might not realize. Because especially if we're porous, they're entities that's like the souls of people who have passed and are still stuck in a very painful state might attach to us and have a lot of faith in us that will heal it. Or sometimes we're called to do a whole line of healing, an ancestral line of our own heritage, but sometimes it's a completely different cultural group. So there's a lot that can come up when we start opening what I would call then the air element, your highest truth, your wisdom. So when you do it in a balanced way and connect also with earth, and earth, I have them not compared to others, but really track and trace their growth, not just physical growth, but your spiritual growth. You're kind of matching it. It's all like yin yang. You're only taking as much as you can integrate. And the same with fire. Fire is the protective guide. And so and feeling would be the emotions and your intuition. So often people can also get overwhelmed when there's so much emotion that they're then tapping into. And so when it's balanced with fire, and in terms of this self-protection, because some of the emotions could be from some entity who's hurting, who's harmful, aggressive, or whatever, the fire element would hold that at bay. So it's integrated in a very balanced way, and you're only able to handle as much as you're able to ground and protect yourself from. So that's how the safety measures are put in. And the air element offers more spaciousness. So it really helps with some of that dualistic thinking, or the usual familiar and often negative stories that people may have internalized. So it's creating more spaciousness, more insight, and new stories and new solutions also needs to happen in a balanced way as new information comes in. So it's a little tricky sometimes with people with a lot of energy and a lot of emergence and a lot of stuff happening, to be patient enough to set this up right. But when I explain that, I usually get cooperation. Even then, even when for years people have been holding this imbalance and doing amazing good work, sometimes still something can spike up, and you'll be surprised. Somebody very advanced can end up in a crisis and in a very risky situation. But fortunately, each time, because of all the skills that they have, we've been able to resolve it within a day.
Wow.
So I'm very,
so you kind of describing, the way you're describing it is, I'm seeing like you're creating a sanctuary, a safe space for people within themselves. And we've talked about some people in Emerging Proud are setting up safe spaces, like physical safe spaces, where people be held to kind of process this stuff. But the way you work with people, it sounds like you work on very much creating an individual safe space within a person. Would you say that?
Right, exactly. Where I want to teach them, you hit it on the nail, because so many of us therapists, we have this sacred space that we offer our clients. And then I discovered they did well in my presence, but had a lot of trouble at home, or it wasn't, they were ready to understand what I did, and I couldn't articulate it. And so I wanted to teach them what I did, but at the same time, personalize it, which is very similar to how depth hypnosis works. It's the structure, and you're teaching people to become their own healers, to access their own guides. I'm just structuring it a little bit in a way where I felt it was universal enough. So most people, that's why it took so long. I tested it with many different peoples, different ages, different walks of life, genders, and issues that they presented with. And it has worked with all of them. So this feels like a universal structure where I'm almost enveloping them in this soul sanctuary, in this alchemy, and they're inside of me. And it's not that one is bigger or better, because I learn a lot from their guides and what comes through, and it's a conversation with my guides and their guides, but it's almost like I'm role modeling energetically how to hold the sacred space within themselves so they can have this transformation happen safely. And hence the name Soul Sanctuary Alchemy. Yeah. And I really imagine them like a caterpillar dissolving and transforming and becoming this butterfly.
Love that image. I'd written about that on the campaign too. Yeah, gosh, just making me think how much psychiatry has to learn, and how unsafe actually a lot of the practices are, and how misunderstood all of this is. Is your new book, Loraine, is that going to be based around, is it a guidebook based on this model?
Yes, it's in the works. I'm right now focusing more on creating an online course, but I would love for the handbook that goes with it to become a guidebook. And I do want to say some of the complexities of this is that I can get away with that, with not interacting with the world of psychiatry and clinical psychology, because many of my clients are very much, even they come to me, have one foot in that world. They've been diagnosed, sometimes seen maybe for 20 minutes years ago and still clinging on to certain diagnosis. Some are taking medication, some are not, and working with all that. The guides, I don't am not the one to say this is not right for you. The guides actually teach them all that. They teach them the impact the medication has on them, teach them each of their encounters, if they were at a psychiatric hospital or different therapies, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful. So they get all that learning from the inside out.
Wow, and that's what I love so much about this movement and your work. It's just about empowering someone, isn't it, to find their inner wisdom and their inner healer, which is so different to the paradigm that we have at the moment. It's beautiful, beautiful. I'm so excited about this butterfly emerging. It's like, it feels like it's been a long time coming.
Yes, yes. And so many of us, I mean, you know, you have people who know, and my kind of, I guess the way I've been putting it in terms of like redivining and reframing this playing small is, I see it as safekeeping, as wisdom keeping. There are many clients who I also see who have not, they knew intuitively not to go into, you know, seeing a therapist, or seeing them once and ran. And so there's a lot that so many of us have done, just fumbling and scrambling around, trusting our intuition without any resources. And so I often, you know, end up just validating them so much for holding on to that truth, even if they were a singular lone wolf and didn't even know what they were doing, why they were doing it. And then their guides end up showing them why what they did was the best thing they could have done for themselves. It's really beautiful.
Right.
I feel like I'm just often the tip of the iceberg, helping them pull it all together, even though they end up doing a lot of, I see it as they're hurting, they're healing, they're helping. So they're often at the end of their hurting, they pull it together very quickly. Then they start healing their families, their ancestors, all the spirits around them. And then they go off and are following their calling. That's just the kinds of clients I see. I'm in Berkeley. And so what I do is not as weird at all in this area. So I just want to say that I'm not that brave. It's just like, yeah, another one in that corner and another one in that corner. And in my office. So yeah, the clients that I get are often Berkeley students, and they're wonderfully talented. And a lot of people, you know, in that mecca ready for this. So I'm just feel very honored to set them up right, give them the right tools, and send them off into the world to do their thing.
Wow, it must be so rewarding to see that. Gosh.
Yeah.
So if people would like to be part of your course or want to find out more about you, how might they go about doing that?
Well, I would say my online home is my website. That would be the place, the hub where they could find all kinds of information. And that's the Sacred Healing Well. And I also started a Facebook group for just women identified, and it's called Awaken Your Amazon Goddess. And Amazon is just because of the meaning that has, but it's really for me, but it's just the divine feminine, however they define their goddess self, they're welcome in there. And I provide a lot of free information that is related to the soul sanctuary, any articles, any meditations that supports the thinking around this, and they get to hear the newest updates in terms of this course, which I hope would come out and be ready to be launched maybe in September. Okay. So they would find out about that there, but also by joining my newsletter. And I do have two gifts that I offer people who join my newsletter. One is the first chapter of my memoir, and another is a meditation, a barrier breaking meditation that's sound guided. It's a poem that I wrote and recite in that welcoming email.
Beautiful. I'd really recommend signing up to that, folks. It's an amazing website.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Are you holding a waiting list or anything, Loraine, for your course, or is that not ready? You
I
know.
have not started that, but if they sign up or they're in that Facebook group, they'll be the first to hear. And I do have a few people on a list who just informally have told me they're interested. But soon there will be a list to sign up. I probably have a webinar as well, some more formal information about what all would be covered in that course. So if
Great.
people are
Maybe we
in,
can do this again, sort of nearer the time, and you're
yeah,
ready and promote in more detail. I'm happy to do that. I think you're right. I think there are so many people who have this kind of intuitive knowing that they need a different resource to the current sort of, you know, whatever biomedical model is offering at the moment, and sort of waiting for this kind of thing to come along. So I can see this being, you know, maybe you're creating a model that is going to be used and disseminated out. Who knows? Let's hope, hey? I'm forever.
I am so delighted. I see it as a 3-course model. So the first would be just to learn how to build your chrysalis, and even people who have done this before, they would just learn more in terms of being more balanced. I do this every time with my clients, and I keep on learning. And they can also expand the number of guides who are there to help them. They're just get more and more fine-tuned. I have dozens of guides I work with, so even advanced people could go through this aspect of the training. And then the second one would be about the transformation and doing deep healing. And then the third part would be more advanced and really getting in touch with your callings and starting to maybe heal ancestral pain, or really become clear in terms of what this should look like in terms of a mission that they would want to bring out in the world. So that's the phase of the emergence with the wings and spreading your magical pollen around.
Yeah, I've had that vision too.
Oh, great.
The spider's web with all of the connected lights, and kind of I had that vision, like a connected web of lights over the globe of us all connecting.
Yes.
I think of so many.
Yeah, that's why we're soul sisters. We've had these similar visions.
Like, oh hi, I've known you for thousands.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. So speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Loraine.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to talk about my model. Thank you so much for the service that you provide. You've inspired me. Just knowing what you do and reading about your work, it gives me courage as well.
Well, likewise. The more I connect with amazing people like you, the more I think, yeah, I can carry on doing this. It's okay.
We'll be okay.
Even if we're not, we'll just all get together somewhere.
Yeah, we'll come back.
Go in the corner over there somewhere.
I say nothing is lost. If I have to share something with your audience, if they have family members who are mentally ill, they do such hard work, and they feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not seeing any progress. Why am I even doing this? The most beautiful things happen when these family members have passed on, and there's not a shadow of a doubt that the work they've done paid off, and these family members are clear and able to communicate to them after they passed on. And not only that, like, they would have synchronistic experiences during memorials and things like that. Very, very clear validation of the work that they've done. So if that's any solace for anybody who's not able to experience that in this life, I've seen it over and over again. The universe just, the beautiful thing is, right, the universe just folding in and supporting this work through synchronistic guidance in this life and beyond. So I have seen it so many times that I'm not even doubting that, but I know many people are. So just wanted to leave them with that.
Thank you. Beautiful message. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think, also hearing people who've had journeys like yours and struggled, throughout your teenage and early 20 years, like I did too, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And, who knows, if we are crazy at the end of the day, at least we've lived a happy life, hey? So we're going wrong.
That's my thinking. When clients say, well, I'm just imagining and it's a delusion, I'm like, so is every other reality. Why not pick the one that's most fun?
Exactly.
Makes you healthy also. So yeah, that's mine.
Well, I'm blessing the universe
Yes.
for crossing our paths. It's lovely to
Yeah.
meet you, and yeah, let's reconnect when your course is due to launch. I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Have a lovely day or evening. My day. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely day yourself. Bye.